Hi, everyone. We are going to be presenting, my group and I, on the work we've done over the last few months and investigating the public space permit policies and the case study of the Anthem. Before we jump into our presentation, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself and the rest of the group. So my name is Elodie, and I've been working as a project manager.
I'm Nica. I've been a researcher and I'm an employee at the Anthem, hence the t-shirts and my work shirts. So I was able to connect us with people. And one of them, it was my department that does this, but that was a really big coincidence. So we'll go back to that.
I'm Max. I'm the urban planning lead.
Hi, I'm Bettina. I'm the communications and outreach coordinator.
Hi, everyone. I'm Colton. I've been doing GIS and data collection.
So this is just the general outline of our presentation today. We're going to start off just giving an introduction to the concept of our case study and an introduction to the study area and venue, discuss some of the permit process from the venue side, the challenges and recommendations that we've come up with. So the venue, or the Anthem, is a 6,000 capacity entertainment venue located in the Wharf neighborhood in Southwest DC. The Anthem opened in 2017 and has since grown to host over 250 shows each year. Typically, performers and their crews will arrive 8 to 12 hours before a show to set up and leave within a few hours after the show ends. While the Anthem has a dedicated private loading dock used by performers to load and unload the equipment, there are around 30 to 40 shows each year that require additional space to accommodate more vehicles. In these instances, the Anthem must obtain public right-of-way occupancy permits, or PROOPs, to secure enough space for loading and unloading outside the venue, and they use metered and unmetered parking spots. Since July 2022, the Anthem estimated that they obtained around 55 permits, as each show needs to get its own permit. However, the Anthem has requested relief from the PROOP notification requirements due to the tedious and burdensome process that's difficult when scheduling the timelines of performers.
And the Anthem is just part of the larger Wharf development seen in the Southwest waterfront. And the Wharf is the ongoing redevelopment agenda that has reshaped Southwest DC, constructed by P.N. Hoffman and Stroger Brothers. The Wharf envisions itself as its own village, consisting of largely mixed-use development. Wharf developers hope to create walkable and enjoyable spaces for residents, workers, and visitors. It has become a destination for recreation due to the vibrant mix of retail, restaurants, events, and recreational activity. Phase 1 development consists of 3 hotels, 2 office buildings, 2 residential rental buildings, 2 condominiums, and an Anthem Music Hall. Phase 2 is still ongoing, but the Wharf and the city planners made the Wharf accessible through various modes of transportation, including by metro, bike lanes, bus routes, and roadways. Access to commercial loading and unloading zones is especially important for businesses in dense developments, as the street is the main resource for businesses to load and unload. At the Anthem, they use both street parking and commercial loading zones, loading docks due to the nature of the venue. Different artists or events may need more or less space.
And so at the Anthem, in DC, public space is defined. In short, it's the, it's the space between 2 property lines. So on the next slide, there's a bigger version of this diagram, but essentially it's, the sidewalk, the bike lane, the roads, even those tree spots, so they're considered public space. And kind of one subcategory of public space, since it's in between these 2 property lines, is the commercial loading zone. And so this is how the Anthem is then able to use PROOP. Elodie defined it a little bit and explained it's just the right to occupy public space. And so along this strip, the Anthem, there's a nail salon, UPS, and a bike shop. They really intimately share the commercial loading zone, and there's an alleyway right off the block there too. And long story short, the Anthem will take this commercial loading zone with the parking permit, but then UPS still needs to come and deliver packages, even if they have 3 semi-trucks there. They still need to deliver packages. The bike shop still needs to deliver bikes. So we're trying to think of a more fluid and less rigid system to occupy this public space.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Anthem itself and its loading zones, the permitting process, and the fees required. And so the loading zones are listed in order of priority for use by the Anthem. So they use a private loading zone, and if they need more space, then they go to the unmetered parking across the street. And so firstly, the Anthem has its own private loading zone located in the alleyway on the northeast side of the block. The loading zone holds 2 vehicles as indicated in figure 2. And they also receive permission from the wharf that allows them to place a 3rd vehicle where a lot of artists have their vans for the Anthem show. And the second option they use is the unmetered commercial parking across the street, or actually in front of the building on Main Avenue. And so this area is actually designated loading zone by DDOT for commercial entities from the block. And the Anthem requests these public occupancy permits for the commercial loading zone for large events, just to make sure that all the other entities on the block aren't taking up the space. And then lastly, across the street, there's metered parking on Main Avenue. So this is typically used by private individuals, although when the Anthem has those occupancy permits for commercial loading, the other entities on the block, such as Unlimited Biking, they put their transit vehicles there as a replacement. And the next slide here just shows a visual of where the Anthem's private loading zones are in the alleyway, and then they have the DOT commercial loading zone right outside the Anthem, and then across the street at the meter park.
In order to better understand the permitting process, we interviewed Patrick O'Connor, who's the operation manager at the Anthem. Patrick uses DC's transportation online permitting system to apply for a parking permit. Patrick also applies for the other reserved parking permit and shows us the days, times, and number of metered and non-metered parking spaces that the Anthem needs to use. The website prompts Patrick to select whether it blocks a loading zone, and he clicks yes. Technically, vehicles without a permit can only be there for short-term loading and unloading processes, but the Anthem vehicles have to stay for the whole day, as they can't park in the adjacent parking garage due to the height limit. Patrick noted that there are a lot of communication issues between the Anthem and the wharf, as well as the neighborhood with DC. He noted that there was no way to communicate with nearby businesses, which would be something he would want to see if the website improved. As for fees, the application and permit is $50, but with the technology fee of 10%, the total of the parking permit is $55. If the Anthem needs additional parking, they can park at the Banneker Circle Street area, where they could pay the rate of the meter by the hour. The Anthem has to use meter space in about 1 in every 7 shows. The permitting process can be a tedious task, something that Patrick should not have to prioritize with his job. He has to print a new permit for every show, totaling about 150 permits every year. Usually, Patrick will create an application for 1 to 2 weeks worth of shows at a time, and then has to go to the permit office to print out the official permit signs. The entire process takes over 45 minutes, which includes travel time. If the permitting process goes wrong, like if the signs were put on incorrectly or not posted 24 hours beforehand, parking enforcement can ticket the vehicles $50, and that cost is, the Anthem is responsible for that cost. Patrick is not aware of any option of permit renewal, and he's also complained that the website and computer run very slow, making it all a very discouraging process. He has not interacted with Park DC's interface, which highlights the lack of information and communication for permit users and the Department of Transportation.
And so on October 18th, we did a site visit. My supervisor led us to the DCRA building where you can print the permit itself. And it took us about 15, 20 minutes, like under a mile to get there. And you had to go through security, then you go up, elevator. It's a very tight space. There's construction. It takes a while. The computer's very slow. It's a little office with like 3 people, and you're just like trying to print this permit. And only, what's the word? Certain people can print these permits. So it's my supervisor and then the manager. And they're only open, certain hours a day. So we saw a lot of limitations. It's essentially my point here. And in the middle, that's an example. I'm sure you've seen these permits all over DC. Reserved parking, you have an arrow, the time. And he, fun fact, didn't know you could print these permits for weeks at a time until a couple days before we saw him. So he was printing permits like every single day. And again, we could say it's a user error, but it also reflects like something in the system that isn't working, which was our biggest takeaway. And the last thing I'll say is on the left side, you'll see this is, like I mentioned, a commercial loading zone. And that was a big question mark to us where we were like, okay, this is already designated as a commercial loading zone. Like, why, do they have to get these permits, and how can we make it better. So that's, I think, one of the biggest takeaways.
And so in the next section, we'll just talk a bit about the challenges that we made note of when speaking to Patrick and Elena, and then also some of the challenges that we noticed on the site visit.
So we noticed through our site visit and our interviews that there are a lot of physical challenges for loading and unloading at the Anthem. One is the ongoing phase 2 construction for the work, and that means the space can be occupied sometimes. The goal of mixed use created a shared alleyway between the channel apartments and the Anthem, and this means they must communicate more in order to use this limited space. And then there are also overweight vehicles involved, and this poses another challenge because of the routes and restrictions of space and movability of these vehicles.
And so for traffic volume, the DC Department of Transportation uses the Highway Performance Monitoring System, or HPMS, to track traffic numbers in both directions on a 3-year cycle. The counts are converted to what is called an annual average daily traffic, so AADT. And this is the count of the number of vehicles that access the highway block over a year. And so as detailed in the map, Main Avenue has an AADT of 12,373 vehicles in 2020. And so given the studies are conducted on 3-year cycles, it's pretty reasonable to assume that this AADT number is going to considerably increase due to the increased commercial and residential development in the work.
And so communication challenges, I've kind of already talked about these, but I want to reiterate, we got feedback that, businesses were being ticketed for being in the commercial loading zone. So again, another question, you're like, well, this is their zone. Why are they experiencing ticketing? Maybe they stay a little bit past the designated time on the permit, or maybe they don't post the signs 24 hours in advance. But again, these things, like, instead of blaming the users, seeing again, how can the system be better? So that was one communication challenge between DDOT and between the businesses that are using their service. And then Bettina mentioned earlier that the businesses don't have a way to communicate with each other. So they share this commercial loading zone. And we went into the different businesses and asked them questions. And they were like, yeah, sometimes we just the Anthem has their permit up, but the UPS guy especially, he was like, we're UPS, we have to deliver packages 8 times a day. So there'll be these big semi trucks and they just kind of put their car in really fast and unload and go. So that was something that manager at the store said he really wanted to improve how to, something Max and I reflected about was mixed use spaces are a zone of community. So how can we cultivate that and encourage it instead of creating tension between people? And just to encourage DDOT that they have, the means to improve these systems. And Elodie's going to talk about the grant that they have in question. And this is what we're really hoping that they implement, not just here, but elsewhere.
One of the biggest challenges that kept coming up when we interviewed with Patrick and then on the site visit was how inefficient the website design that they use, transportation online permitting system, how inefficient it is. And that's the website that they use to obtain these permits. And his main issue was that the software was so slow and that each task is put onto different pages. Well, it may seem like a small thing, splitting up the tasks onto multiple pages when you have to go through each page, reconfirming multiple times that you are in fact obtaining a permit for a metered space. It really sucks up a lot of time, these small inefficiencies in the grand scheme of the process when it's already so time consuming. It really adds up. And so any new module created in part of DC should aim to relieve the tedious and repetitive nature of the top system and make it more intuitive for the user.
Now we're going to move on to our own group's policy recommendations, and we're going to begin with a case study on the city of Philadelphia, and then we're going to talk about our new permitting modules.
So in order to see what could be improved in DC, we looked at a similar sized city in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, temporary occupancy permits have similar requirements, except there are a few notable differences. One is that they have a more dynamic aspect of permitting because they require the length of the vehicle and the number of containers they might use for the spot. They also charge based on space and depending on location. So in the university and city centers of Philly, permits cost $50 for 40 feet of parking space. And in other areas of the city, it costs $25 for 40 feet of space. In order to reduce unsafe and illegal loading practices, Philadelphia started a smart loading pilot program, which utilizes an app for delivery drivers. So the Pebble Drive mobile app allows users to reserve spots virtually and pay 5 cents per minute and authorize the routes. So some lessons that could be implemented in DC are a solution that should emphasize flexibility and implement some pay-by-use structure, optimize the limited space by creating specific parking spaces, and promote communication and allow businesses to know what spaces to conserve and allow them to the best spots.
So when we were tasked with this project, our main objective was to come up with a solution or recommendations for how DDOT can dedicate funding for its Part DC and create a new module for special event permits and venues like the Anthem. When we discussed this as a team, we wanted to find one that would truly benefit the Anthem, but was also possible within DC's current regulatory environment. And we also wanted to really touch upon the challenges that the Anthem brought up. So the one that we're presenting today is one of the most impactful recommendations that we came up with for the new permitting module that can be implemented for TOPS or in the new Part DC platform.
So based on the Philadelphia case study, we came up with a module that can provide real-time information on the 4 commercial loading zones on 990 Main Avenue. Since 990 Main Avenue is already designated as a commercial loading zone, non-commercial and personal vehicles are not allowed to park there.
And so how this works is that a business or entity would have to register on DTOPS, verify that they're the business or institution. And then they could either ahead of time or the day of, rent, what's the word? Reserve, there you go, reserve. I was like, reserve spots, and also just see the movement that day, anticipate how they want to use it. And they can see live updates in the top right on the red.
The module is inspired by real-time updates, as Nica said, by WMATA for their bus times. So instead of having to go to the DDOT building to print out the official signs, approved businesses can request a spot for a certain amount of time online and print out a ticket slip to put the permit on the car's dashboard. The new system would effectively virtualize and eliminate the need to print out signs. However, you would still need to print permits to place in the vehicles, but this can be done at home base.
And so this modules would connect with ticketing officers who are tasked with enforcing parking regulations. And so if other commercial loading vehicles from unapproved entities that reside on Main Avenue want to reserve a space, they would have to apply for a permit the traditional way.
It would also be great because adding a communication platform for the commercial entities to communicate on, while it would depend on DDOT, it would really help increase the coordination and transparency between all businesses that are on 990 Main Ave and allow them to work with each other to use the slots more efficiently.
If DDOT uses parking by use versus parking by day, it could still use this website as an assessment of relative use of the loading zone and bill or ticket each entity either every month, every week, or even every year. This way, workers like Patrick don't have to leave their place of work and spend 45 minutes obtaining a permit every time it's needed.
And to respond to the challenges that have come up with having a more rigid permitting system, we also leave a spot dedicated to short-term parking for drop-offs, meaning less than 15 minutes, would be useful for businesses like UPS and unlimited biking.
Thank you guys so much for listening to our presentation.
Start unless anybody else wants to go. Who you are? I'm Dave Lipscomb. I'm the Curbside manager for DDOT, and I was behind, I guess, the impetus for this project. We've been working with the Anthem for a couple of years, and this issue came to our attention a couple of years ago, and we found some opportunities where we might be able to enhance permitting through Part DC or some other systems. So it's great to have some great young minds to work on it to at least get us started. We actually have put in a budget request to try to do this through Part DC. So great presentation, great work. And the question I have is this, and it's not really one that's all that related to regulations or technology or software or anything like that, but it's a more philosophical question. Why should I, if I should, why should I give this private entity any space, any public space, when it does have its own private space for these activities? There's no wrong or right answer to that. So this is not a trap, but I'm curious, just in doing this project, what your thoughts are on that. Should we give private entities this kind of public space again when there was something built in the design for this? And, you know, as we've discovered, it wasn't adequate for what their future demand was. I think it's arguable whether that demand could have been anticipated, and I don't want to take y'all down into the political rabbit hole, but just curious your thoughts about, should we do this for private entities? Why? And sort of how does that interact or conflict with our theories about public space and its use by the public and private entities?
So I would say the Nationals Park, and if you look at that example, they have personalized stadium zone park signs. So National Park, the Nationals organization, they provide a specific value to the Washington, D.C. community. And I think that you could argue that the Anthem, bringing in people, artists from around the world, bringing in fans from around the world, and using WMATA to get people to the Wharf, which is a newly developed zone. I think it's important that GDOT works with the commercial entities to make sure that they're able to meet the commercial load.
Yeah, and like the private spot they have right now, the nature of it, which is an alleyway, right? The nature of it too is that, like we said, they're sharing it with not those two private docks, but the space leading into it, they're sharing with the apartment complex and others. And a big issue that's just arisen that, you know, you don't anticipate until people use the space and you see how intuitively it happens. Like if somebody's moving into their apartment, they put their U-Haul in there. And then, you know, an example I have is Lil Nas X is trying to get into the building. Where does he go? It's also the door to get into the Anthem. So I think because it wasn't anticipated, like there's a responsibility to respond because nothing is fixed like in the world at this philosophical level. Like people have created fixed systems. So we have to like respond to it in a more close way.
The quick pushback. Stadium zone. So the stadium zone signs below M Street say you cannot park there. Nobody can park there. We do reserve space for the team buses to load on Potomac Avenue, which I think is, I think they just can't accommodate the buses inside. So, you know, that's another, I don't know when that stadium design was completed, probably something like 20 years ago, literally at this point. So I hear exactly what you're saying, but that programming is not quite exactly what you might think it is. The other part is, and again, no wrong or right answer, everything that you've described about the conflicts and other uses and that sort of thing, how is that a me problem as the steward of the public space and not a you problem as perhaps a poor planner when it comes to what you thought your demand would be?
Part of it is the responsibility of just setting up the infrastructure that allows these different businesses to have those pathways of communication because they are sharing those spaces. And that was one of the big things is it's really hard for these different businesses or the Anthem to communicate with the neighborhood of the ward. And so I think like the bare minimum that you could do is just allowing these, like the space or giving, I don't know the right word, how to phrase it, like the pathways for them to just communicate and sort of like have the footing there to do that.
And that's like a function of public space is the ways that, you know, the space you are occupying allows people like in the, because it impacts just like everyday people walking by too. You know, the fact that the Anthem, like those two loading zones, and also it's like the wharf builders, right? It's another Anthem as this private business. It's like, hey, we need more support because those trucks, they're right next to the bike path, they're right next to the sidewalk, and people are occupying those spaces too. So like this could even take a further question of like, you know, is that, I'm just posing like another question, is 990 even the best, you know, loading place? Because again, it interferes with the bike path. Like I cycle to work and almost every day I almost run into people because they're unloading the trucks there. So just again, posing like a third question. It's like, so that just, my point is that, you know, that is a function of public space. It's the way that it impacts, you know, community.
Yeah, I think that's a great and thoughtful answer. And clearly we are trying to explore some alternative way of doing this. So I'm not trying to say that I think you all are heading down the wrong path. But I think that's an important thing to consider. We don't think about in planning the interaction of public and private space. We either think about, all right, I'm constructing something on public or private land, or I'm trying to facilitate some activity in public space. But when they have to interact with each other, it gets way more complicated. And it's like, well, do I prioritize the UPS person to the ticket holder? Lil Nas X is God, to the public space manager. He's just another person going in the building, right? So
Yeah.
Great presentation, y'all. Thanks.
Yeah, I got one. I think it's fair, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is exactly why we have capstone projects. I mean, this is not the type of thing you read in a book and like that, everything you were describing as far as the challenges of development review process and how the shortcomings in that have now led to operations, and they have to work with operations, but from the perspective of a use that everybody wants to be successful, as well as the partnership. So how does all that go together? That is what we deal with in our industry every day.
Hear that? Real work.
Yeah.
Thanks again. To invite up the second group, which is Albertson Company, Tysons Urban Center Curbside Management.
Okay, hello everybody. Paul, I'm the project manager.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elle, and I'm the urban planner.
Colin, I was one of our GIS folks.
Nick, I was also on data collection and GIS. Colin.
I'm Cortney. I was also an urban planner. Denise, communications and outreach.
So before we start out, I just want to thank some of our partners for this. So we work with Henry Stein McCartney of Fairfax County Department of Transportation and Jacob Malio of the IBI Group. For CurbIQ, Larry Marcus and Dale Fire, and Forward Progress, and obviously thank you to everybody in Sutton. So here's just a little introduction to what our project is about. We really view it as kind of the coming together of two different strains of research and progress. So the first is kind of the change in Tysons. So Tysons is obviously trying to turn itself into a more residential heavy and mixed use urban landscape as opposed to just being kind of a office space heavy community. So three main developments of that. The first is the extension of the Silver Line into Tysons. The second is substantial building of residential units within Tysons. And the third, which is the one that we're focusing on, is changing and curbside management, especially introducing managed parking. So that is Fairfax County Department of Transportation, previously did a study kind of understanding the parking usage currently within Tysons, and is waiting for further funding to do an implementation study of managed parking. And the second kind of aspect that we're building on is last year's capstone research project that's also focused on Tysons. And we're kind of splitting from them in two ways. First of all, they focus mostly on commercial areas, and we focus mostly on residential areas, as those are the areas that are really experiencing a lot of growth within Tysons. And the second is they were really focused on kind of what is going on currently, and we're really focusing on how to implement that, because that's where FCDOT is at this point in the project. So we really have three main roles within the group. So the first is gather data. JS team, well, all of us, but especially JS team, went out to Tysons and used CurbIQ, which is an IBI group tool, and to go out and gather data. We communicated with stakeholders, both residential buildings as well as businesses, and also integrated a lot of urban planning concerns and guidelines from Fairfax County Department of Transportation. So we're really focusing on planning the implementation of curbside changes, focusing mostly on managed parking, but taking a broader look at really how to make Tysons into a more livable and less car-safe city.
Yeah, so this is Tysons right now as it stands. So the essential plan for this project is to take all of these super blocks or large developments, typically for offices, and the plan is to break them down for mixed use, commercial and residential development, make it more accessible. So here we can just see the current state of roads and bike lanes in Tysons. And on the next slide, we just highlighted the three areas of focus that we're going to be looking at today. So we have West Park Drive, Jones Branch Drive, Park Run Drive. Here's another highlighted area we looked at, but we're not really going to focus on it today. So I'll let the urban planning.
Yeah, so the first study site we focused on is 7903 West Park. This is a transition from setback office space into a mixed use commercial and residential development. This image is from 2007. This is what the area looked like before redevelopment, and we're going to be focusing on the development or the redevelopment process rather. So this is set back from the curb. There's not really much of a curb access here. There's a small sidewalk. But as we'll see when we look closer at the curb itself, not much development to be done there whatsoever. There are dedicated entrance and exit ramps in a surface parking lot here to access both of these buildings. This is what it looks like now. So this has been redeveloped. There is one finished building here and one building that's currently under construction. These are both mixed-use residential and commercial spaces. They have now these dedicated private roads that kind of connect the area. So replacing those dedicated on-off ramps with accessible streets. These all have street parking on them. And as we noted throughout this process, none of the street parking is metered. That's all free parking. This is kind of coupled with, as we can see in this image, a parking garage that accesses the building. This is dedicated to residential dwellers and also the employees of that particular residential community. And we can also kind of see the current curb on the front-facing road that's also got that dedicated parking on it, a few street trees, a bike lane, and a couple of bike statement racks. The original curb here is a bit further forward than it is now. So this comes up right to the travel lane. And as we can kind of see, this is while the building was in development. We can see where the building ends up being and this kind of space that was removed in order to create a lot of the curb features that we're going to be talking about. So this is what it looks like now. This is pretty much the same position in that second travel lane. So we've got a bike lane, we've got dedicated parking here. This is all free parking, a couple of street tree and like these planter sections, and then a section of dedicated sidewalk space that bumps up right against the commercial area. So there is the Agora, which is a restaurant in here. There's also a fitness center and access to the building itself. As we can also see in that image, there is a truck parked in the bike lane. That is something that we noticed a couple of times. These bike lanes are unprotected. They're just lines. And the parking is right next to them. So as we'll talk about a little bit further, there are some options to use the parking itself to protect the bike lane.
So one of Tysons' primary objectives that they outline in their comprehensive lot is to reduce the general suburban focus on isolated buildings and like surface parking lots to form an engaged streetscape and connected neighborhoods. And so this is one of like the many transformations that is happening in Tysons that kind of exemplifies this. It used to be kind of a barren parking lot, and now it's turning more mixed use. So one of the ways that they plan to accomplish the overarching goal, as I just said, is to increase mixed use and transit-oriented development, especially nearby where the Metro Rail station areas are. So West Park Drive, 7903, it's about a 10-minute walk or so from the West Park Drive, making it one of the perfect cases for this. And so West Park Drive as a whole is an example of a minor arterial road, which basically its main function is to support larger boulevards by providing alternate paths and diverting vehicular traffic so that it emphasizes transportation on a much more local level. So kind of like breaking up the big super blocks. And as shown in the slides, 7903, it was rezoned to be mixed use, and with the intention of it kind of becoming an extension of the borough. The borough is basically an up and coming, like increasingly walkable urbanized downtown area located like a 5-minute walk. I don't know which direction, but it's like a little bit to the left when you look at it on a map. And basically, because of this increased infrastructure and traffic in the area, a lot of issues with overparking and general accessibility have obviously arose. So in terms of accessibility, although there's been an addition of a median separating traffic, walkability is still generally pretty limited to pedestrians. Walk times are very low on crossings, and it's not very pedestrian friendly as a whole. There's also a generally low amount of handicap parking that we observed around here. I think we saw one spot on the curbside, but for the most part, the handicap parking is limited to inside of the parking garage, which you have to be a part of the residential or office area to get inside. So that's not great if you're going to the resident, up to the restaurant or to the fitness center. So, and then like Colin said, we also observed a lot of parking violations in the bike lanes and curbside cuts. A lot of times like FedEx, UPS, those kind of trucks, when they were making like deliveries to any of the people in the mixed use buildings, they were just kind of parking in the bike lanes and then just double parking there. So that was obviously not ideal.
Now onto just outreach and feedback from the 3 establishments along West Park Drive that we've discussed. So I've just decided to focus on these 3, but for just this presentation, I'll just focus on Agora. So I spoke with their general manager when we did our field research. And so far, he said that they are satisfied with their curb space. He doesn't see a large room for improvement because they have an off-site loading dock that they use regularly, about once or twice a week. And they personally waive the garage parking fees for all of their patrons through an agreement with the New Bell Apartments that has a garage right underneath the restaurant. And also he's mentioned that they have very low pedestrian traffic for the points that Cortney mentioned in the slide previously. However, there have been some obstacles with them wanting to have approved outdoor and patio seating. So the manager has expressed that they have submitted a proposal for outdoor seating and patio construction every year since 2019, and it keeps getting denied by the District Advisory Board for Tysons Transportation. So he was very willing to kind of express his frustration with us, and that has been moved to kind of the top of their priority list. So yeah, that's just it for this pretty here.
So some quick recommendations that we have would be the implementation of the much larger grid system that the comprehensive plan is planning on eventually implementing throughout all of Tysons, but basically the addition of much smaller minor streets around this area to contribute to the emerging grid system, and breaking up the super blocks to increase transportation on a more local level and increase pedestrian and biking accessibility. Also, the addition of more bike infrastructure, like we said earlier, the bike lanes are just 2 lines basically on the ground, so it's not protected. There's also not a ton of bike parking, and so because it's just lines, it doesn't really. There's a de-emphasis on not committing parking violations essentially, and there's over parking in the bike lanes when spots aren't available. And so that's not very good. So we think that adding bike infrastructure would be ideal. And then also expanding curbside bus infrastructure. It's not very obvious where these bus stops are. And so by making more like scheduling, seating, and protection from the elements, that would also de-emphasize the amount of cars that are on the road and taking up car spaces. And then overall help with the congestion that's going on, and also making the curbside paid parking. So that way the people who are actually using the immediate building are the ones who are taking up the parking spaces as opposed to parking there and then walking somewhere else.
And this is our second study site, 7915 Jones Branch Drive. This is another redevelopment of a dedicated office space into more mixed use space. The eventual redevelopment will include commercial space, but at this point it's just residential. As we can see here, it was originally a kind of small footprint office building with a considerably large surface parking lot. This was redeveloped. So from 2011 to now, we've kind of modified it so it's a much larger area. Yeah, so this is what it looks like now. It's much denser and kind of fits the entire footprint of that lot. So the surface parking lot has been removed. It's now a parking garage. There is considerable amount of kind of street side parking here. So throughout the entire of all of these kind of 4 access streets here, they all have free street parking. At this point, also, we had a bus stop in front of this particular building when it was an office building. We lost that in redevelopment, so it's not there anymore. This also kind of area includes another bike lane, much like the one that we talked about though in the previous one, is relatively disconnected from the rest of the bike network. We can kind of see it in this image here, but those 2 lines directly in front of the building are really the only section of this bike lane that exists on this road for another like 3 or 4 blocks. There's also 1 stable rack here for 3 bike parking spots. So if 3 people want to bike to work, they can, but that is pretty much it. And that kind of whole land use has been relatively redeveloped. So if we take a look at what the kind of curb used to look like, this is the frontage. As you can see, we also still have that setback. This has kind of been removed, so the lot kind of comes all the way up to the front, and a decent amount of that curb has also been backed off. And there is the bus stop that we lost. This kind of space, as we can see in the kind of current image, one more, has kind of basically been redeveloped into the dedicated curb space. Here's our 1 block bike lane, our street parking, and the kind of like front-facing apartments. Now, the entrance to the apartment is actually on the back side of this building. There are, if you give a ground floor apartment, you do have access from the street, but the kind of walkability element is a little bit limited by the fact that there's no real front-facing access to this building.
So what Colin mentioned previously, the majority of this lot, if not all of it, is occupied by the Highgate at the Mile, which is an apartment complex that has around 350 units. So when we did our field research, I reconnected with their lead property manager. So he expressed that moving forward, they have a clean curb aesthetic in a way of how they want very minimal seating or even just bike or scooter parking, and instead want many small pockets of green space. As referred to the photo in the bottom left, that was in their plan prior to 2017. And he also mentioned that there was a recent audit of curb space about 2 to 3 weeks ago, and he was willing to kind of compile and share the data with us when he gets a chance to, so we can further develop our analysis. But given the recent audit, it was to kind of aid in construction approval for an additional apartment building. And that is part of a larger project in this top right that would span to roughly 3 million square feet across 8 separate blocks. And this project is funded by Kettler, which is one of like the largest multifamily development firms on the East Coast. And just for reference, in DC, they have over 60 like multi-level properties. So this future plan would fund kind of the addition of 9 more buildings, primarily in residential, office, retail, and hotel space, as well as Signature Park, which they're estimating to be around 5 acres. But going back to the audit I mentioned previously, it was to help kind of speed up the approval for construction for another building. And it's expected to be around 50 units larger than the Highgate, which was completed in 2017. And as for curb space, the plan is to implement metered street parking essentially along the entire complex, with residents of apartment buildings and their guests having garage parking underneath all of the residential buildings. But there is one exception, and that will be a bike share station that will be along one of the entrances of the park. They don't have an exact location for it yet, but it is within their written plan.
So the metro station of Tysons got developed in 2014, as Paul mentioned. And before then, the main way of transportation was vehicles. So therefore, the building, as Colin talked about, had more parking rather than mixed residential use one that we have now. As Tysons developed into a transit-oriented development, the development for new office building was to be built 1/4 of a mile from the closest metro stations, and the rest of the development needs to be built within a 1/2 mile ratio of the metro station. So everything is close enough where you can transport by walking or cycling. The rest of the Highgate at the Mile is 97% and 100% residential use, and 0 to 3% retail is from a 1/2 mile from the metro station, as Denise talked about, and it's surrounded by office development. So this building is actually made for office workers to come and live there. The development included major transportation improvement, such as 3 new streets, one that included an offsite connection between Jones Branch and West Branch Drive, which will add to the Tysons-wide and Tysons right of street transportation funds. Moreover, the regulation for parking of any residential building is to be it is described in the comprehensive plan, where the parking spaces are based on the amount of rooms they have. For example, if the building has 1 bedroom, then the maximum and minimum space will be 1.4 spaces for 1,000 square feet. So according to the Fairfax County Police Framework, there has been observed that there is a lot of oversized vehicles parking in the retail spaces where they avoid to look at the retail. So it's kind of bad for the business to have this. And so the recommendation that I made, it was to have a designated spaces for these the oversized vehicles that they can park and they're not in the way for the business to be interrupted. As well as Cortney mentioned, there is also the background that we have. So the recommendation is to expand that so we can have more cyclists and pedestrian people that can do it that will follow the comprehensive plan of Tysons.
And we wanted to round out this discussion by taking a look at one of the streets in the area. So one of the main things we kind of focused on here is also the car travel areas alongside the curb. This is Park Run Drive. It was redeveloped between 2014 and 2016 to kind of change the footprint. So here we've got 4 total travel lanes and undesignated parking along the side in this kind of relatively low density residential area. Our image from 2016 here shows the redevelopment. So we're down primarily to one travel lane for the entirety of, or one travel lane on either side for the entirety of the run. We have a bike lane here that's also not protected. We have dedicated street parking here, not paid for, but it is kind of lined, which is different from the previous image. We also have dedicated turn spaces. So this is kind of just like the relative road reconstructing that's been going on throughout this entire process is to make things in theory more mixed use, but in practice, this area still is very functionally car dependent. And the changes to the roads here, especially with the dedicated turn lanes, make things a little bit easier to drive. It does increase safety, but it doesn't necessarily encourage walkability or, transport by a bike.
Yeah, so as mentioned, this is a very highly residential zone area. It's not very business or entertainment oriented.
So according to the Mercer County Curbside, they noticed that this space and specifically has been full since like 6 in the morning. So they came to the conclusion that there will be construction workers and people that live nearby, but they refuse to pay the fee that their building is requiring for them to have a park. To have a car in their place. So they go and stay on the streets because it's free and they park the spaces. So they're taking the space instead. So our recommendation is to have a parking meter. So people either way will have to pay. Either they will choose to pay for in their residential use or on the streets.
And then we also recommend kind of once again building up like infrastructure to promote that, because right now it's not very cohesive to bikers. We didn't see, I don't think, like anybody biking when we went there because it's just not very biker friendly. The likelihood of you getting kind of like hit is decent, I would say. So yeah, just making bolstering that entire area, protected bike lanes, and also bike parking.
One more question. So when you talked about the Highgate and how it was not aesthetically pleasing for bikes and scooters to not be parked like on the building, I would kind of argue that street parking is not aesthetically pleasing to me. So, and also there's 4 sides to a building. So would you think that maybe they could put the bikes and scooters on the side where it's not facing the curb, but also not facing the front space? Like what's your guys' personal opinions on that?
When I spoke to the manager, his offer of a compromise per se was implemented that in the underground garage parking by like the main entrances. But he didn't indicate that he would ideally like it to be along the curb space.
So I will answer too. So the development also has a park space behind it. So if you talk about bicycle and scooters, they can be possibly in there, so they can also provide like a natural space.
I think it was the first first of all, great presentation, thank you. In the first case you gave, you mentioned that there used to be a bus stop and it was removed. I was wondering if you know of any, like, now that the redevelopment is finished and it seems like there's more density now, do you know if there's any plans to bring it back?
So this bus line is primarily a commuter bus line. It's used to transport people to and from office spaces at this point. So I don't actually know whether they plan on bringing it back. I know that there is another bus stop a little bit, like a couple blocks down from there, which kind of goes to the current office developments. At this point, I don't actually have an answer for you on that.
Hey, if appropriate, could we set up a virtual presentation with him? Yeah, and if you, I would leave it exactly the same, but if you have any of the data, that we could show that as well. Maybe live. Otherwise, great.
Nice job.
Standing ADA parking in DC, so we're back to DC.
So. All right, good afternoon. Thank you guys for coming to listening, for guests as well as hi everybody. My name is Allison. This is Daisy, Jules, Young Coon, and Paulina, and we're here to talk about expanding parking within the district, specifically through an analysis of the CBD, not that kind, but the other one, as well as a case study of the neighborhood of the Navy Yard neighborhood as a growing area. So essentially our project aims to create a methodology to understand the expansion of more progressive installation of ADA accessible parking out the district. Essentially the CBD of Washington, DC has the most proactive installation of accessible parking within the district. And we're hoping to understand what makes CBD unique and individual and how we can apply those characteristics to other areas within the district in order to make parking more accessible for handicapped and disabled individuals. So just a brief little background of what we had in the CBD and what makes it successful. So we, within this district CBD, we have something that's called the Red Top Meter Program. You all know just that if you drive around or if you're just walking around, there's actually 2 red top meters right in front of the Simpson Hall, fun fact. So essentially the Red Top Meter Program was installed and changed and was created in 2017. Before the Red Top Meter Program, the handicap or the disabled ADA parking program within the district was essentially just that people with handicap placards could park anywhere in the district just at the same rate for twice the amount of time. Rather, as a delineation from that, now Red Top Meter spaces are specifically allocated and stated for people with disabled people with handicap placards in order to create and ensure that there are spaces available. We do believe that there is a merit for a policy critique as well, especially considering that most of that this is not like a class-based or an age-based program, and that they still cost the same amount of money. Simply the delineation is that they are more saved and allocated for people who are handicapped. So the reason that it is successful in the Central Business District is that according to the ADA, I don't know if you guys know this, that each city block must have at least 1 handicap accessible parking space. However, in the DC CBD, there must be at least 1 handicap accessible parking space for block face rather than per block. And these are the red metered parking spots as allocated. There are approximately 370 spaces within the CBD, and we hope that understanding the characteristics of the Central Business District will allow us to better have more proactive application and installation of more accessible parking throughout the district as well.
So after doing a bunch of research, or kind of like overarching definition of the CBD is that it's the part of the city that contains the principal commercial streets and the main public buildings. And so essentially they're a product of the United States' large emphasis on urban life, and that like has simultaneously occurred with cities being built around transportation. So after looking through a bunch of articles, we kind of came up with 5 main common characteristics throughout CBDs throughout the country. The first was peak land value intersection, or PLVI, which is the part of the CBD where the land values are at their highest. And this is typically located within a few hundred feet of the geographic center. And there are 2 main indications of where this PLVI is in the CBD, and that's 1, where pedestrians are numerous, and 2, where the intersection of maximum vehicular traffic is. The second characteristic we found was density. CBDs typically have a high density of commercial buildings and a low density of residential buildings. 3 main categories of buildings is retail business, service financial office, and non-central business. And the density of each type of these buildings changes kind of depending on the zone of the CBD they're located in. And because of the high density of buildings and addition to the high land values, there's a general lack of open and green space within CBDs as well. The third characteristic is mixed use. So CBDs today have more mixed use development than they ever have before. And this includes offices, tourist attractions, shops, and cultural and civic institutions. And the location of the buildings are very connected to the PLVI. So for example, the proportion of space devoted to retail businesses decreases with distance from the PLVI, whereas non-central and service financial office uses tend to increase in relative importance with the distance going outward. Next, we have traffic and transit. There's typically heavy vehicular and pedestrian traffic flows within the CBD, as well as lots of traffic congestion and a good amount of public transportation options. The flows are more concentrated typically towards the PLVI. And just as a side note for this characteristic, pedestrian counts and traffic flows might not be entirely accurate because everyone traveling through the CBD may not actually work there. And then the last characteristic we came up with was economics. So there's a high concentration of retail and commercial activity and of the job market in CBDs. And so they're essentially the commercial core. And the concentration of the job market in the CBD means that there's generally a higher employment level in certain sectors within the types of jobs that fall in the CBD. And then lastly, the high land values decrease with the distance out from the PLVI.
So shifting to focus on DC's CBD in general, it's comprised of neighborhoods like Foggy Bottom, Golden Triangle, DuPont Circle, Capitol Hill, the downtown area in general, and the National Mall. And as the country's national capital, the DC CBD has a couple unique characteristics compared to the rest of the country and the world. So first off, the physical geography of DC heavily influenced its initial development as it sits at the intersection of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. Georgetown was one of the first cities because it was a port hub. So the city kind of developed out from there. Additionally, the Potomac River was dredged in the 1880s, which created around 700 acres of additional land. And now that's used mainly for recreational and cultural purposes. That's where the tidal basin and the Lincoln Memorial are today. Some of this land is in the CBD, and the land outside of the CBD in that area also helped to shape the culture of the area. In terms of city planning, DC has, obviously, as the nation's capital, has a lot of federal buildings, which makes it stand out from other CBDs that typically have a very high concentration of commercial buildings. And that fact, as well as the green space it has with the National Mall being part of the CBD, make it easier to determine sharp boundaries for the central business district. We found that the green space and federal buildings were kind of the only 2 very specific qualities that indicate the CBD has a strict boundary. And the grid street system that DC has also helps to limit the sharp boundaries of the CBD. Typically, it's hard to do so because it's hard to tell where the CBD starts and ends, but DC
stands out in that way. As I said, the National Mall is part of the CBD, but there's other green space like plazas, parks, and squares at many of the intersections, like L'Enfant Plaza or McPherson Square. Typically, as JC said, CBDs lack green space and open space because of the commercial focus, but DC also stands out in that way. And there's a higher concentration of historical attractions in DC's Central Business District, including the memorials, the Smithsonian museums, art galleries, things like that, which all draw in a lot of tourism. And Capital One Arena also serves as a cultural center that draws people to the CBD that otherwise might not go there. So these are the 6 metrics that we use to analyze the CBD, and they can also be applied to determine which other neighborhoods in DC have similar characteristics and therefore would require more ADA parking. So first off, land use, we looked at building density and analyzed land use zoning. For public transit, we determined the density of metro and bus stops and the average ridership within each study area. For parking, we looked at the parking meter density. Vehicular and pedestrian traffic are both important when looking at traffic. So we summed the annual average daily traffic for cars and used the pedestrian friendliness index for people. The economic side, we looked at the density of retail sites, and then also we looked at future projections of population and employment changes to help justify why other areas should get more ADA parking according to their expected growth.
So with all that, we came up with a methodology formula to hopefully expand accessible parking in the city. By combining all of the different metrics that we just talked about, we can begin to select and identify suitable neighborhoods that are comparable to the CBD's characteristics so that we can argue for the broader implementation of accessible parking in those suitable neighborhoods. So in essence, when we're examining those neighborhoods, if their metrics and their characteristics resemble that of the CBD, we could say here we should then therefore implement and adopt a greater accessible parking program in that neighborhood. To see this methodology in practice, we decided to examine Navy Yard as our case example neighborhood, particularly due to its prominence in DC, its redevelopment history, as well as some of the current DDOT efforts there. So as I just mentioned, Navy Yard is an up-and-coming neighborhood in DC. It is located in the southeast and is bordered by the Annaca River. And fun fact, DDOT is headquartered there, and so is the U.S. Department of Transportation. And in 2021, parts of the Navy Yard that comprise the Stadium District, which composes of the Nats Park, Audi Field, that area actually implemented its own accessible parking program similar to the CBD's Red Top program. Instead of red tops, they have red poles there to signify accessible parking. Our project, hopefully, and our methodology will therefore not provide insight to not just our project and what we found, but also some of the efforts that DDOT has currently implemented there with such a program. Additionally, the entirety of Navy Yard does not enjoy this accessible parking program, only parts of the Stadium District that's within Navy Yard does. When comparing the CBD to the Navy Yard, plenty of differences are obviously found, but I think it's most important to note that we found approximately 4.5 Navy Yards can fit into the CBD of DC. So there's a pretty huge difference there. And even though we examined over 6 different metrics, given our time restraint, we just like to highlight 3 here for our presentation. That is land use designation, public transit demand, as well as parking availability. All of the spatial data and data that we use for this project came from Open Data DC, WMATA, as well as DOT.
So first we want to talk about land use in both of these areas. One of the most heavily discussed characteristics of the CBD is how the land is used within it. So we pulled data from Open Data DC to compare it. For our analysis, we wanted to focus on the commercial, residential, and mixed use cases as these characterize the CBD. In the CBD, we can see that there are 9.2 million square feet of buildings per square mile. And our analysis found that 45.2% of that land is commercial use, 14.4% is residential use, and 2.2% is mixed use. In Navy Yard, it's important to note that the data set has not yet been updated fully with the new redevelopment going on. So there's a lot of land use data that was missing and didn't have land use attribution. So while there are 7.7 million square feet of buildings per square mile in Navy Yard, we confirmed it, we went out there and checked. The gray boxes, the gray buildings do indicate no data or no land use attribution. However, we found that 13% of the data that existed was commercial, 59.6 residential, and 1% mixed use. And though the land use differs here in our two case study areas, it's important to note that Navy Yard is very rapidly developing and thus still growing. While the data is not complete, our fieldwork reflected that there's an abundance of residential and commercial land use existing and on the up and coming for Navy Yard.
The next metric that we examined was public transportation, and specifically the role of the metro as well as bus routes in these two respective neighborhoods. As seen here with the statistics, we can see that there are obviously more metro stations as well as the density of them in the CBD than the Navy Yard. So the CBD currently has about 5 stations per square mile, whereas the Navy Yard has about 1.6. However, when we actually look at the average weekly ridership data, we can see that the average weekday ridership data per station between the two was fewer than 4,000, suggesting that there is indeed a decent demand for travel to the Navy Yard during the weekday. That difference, however, is not the same for bus stops. We found that there is a much greater density of bus stops in the CBD than Navy Yard, almost a quadruple amount. But also recall that about 4.5 Navy Yards fit into the CBD. Another major caveat of this is the geography of Navy Yard. The Anacostia River borders its southern and southeastern edges, therefore severely limiting the number of connections for both metro as well as bus stops. And given the fact that the Navy Yard is growing rapidly, both in terms of its economy and in population, we can expect there to be more transit options in the future.
So parking was also used as a metric as CBDs have a high density of activities that are accessible both by public transit as well as by car. So you know how it's impossible to find parking in the Central Business District during weekdays. Turns out it's like that every hour of every day, even on a Sunday afternoon. So in our fieldwork, we went out and we assessed parking in the study areas, and we found basically all of the streets lined almost fully with cars. In these maps, you can see the total count of parking meters in the study areas, keeping in mind that a single parking meter can be of a single parking meter type or a multiple parking meter type, meaning that one parking meter can have multiple parking spaces attributed to it. In the CBD, there are 3,625 parking meters, with 584 of those being multiple space meters, making that density 1,305 parking meters per square mile. In Navy Yard, there are 268 parking meters, with 116 of those being multiple space meters, making that density 429 parking meters per square mile. Tying this back to accessible parking, there are 370 accessible parking meters in the CBD as reported by DDOT in 2017. To install the same density of accessible parking meters in Navy Yard, that would require about 83 accessible spaces per square mile. In conclusion, using these metrics, DDOT can begin to identify communities, neighborhoods, and areas that would satisfy the characteristics of the CBD, allowing them to increase accessible parking throughout the entire city by expanding the standards set by the CBD to more regions. Thank you.
Questions from the audience?
Just a comment, the maps were so well done. They were
I was going to say, nobody graduates until I get all of your data. GIS, great presentation, great work there. It's hit the nail on the head of exactly what we're trying to get to. We always have these questions and whether we have the capacity to have somebody actually kind of go through. So this is a great starter kit for me. And this is something we will actually be using. And so, great job there. A couple of things I wanted to respond to. So it's a great presentation. So I just have to nitpick. And, that's just what happens. But I mean, I think if we were engaging a planning firm to do like a full-on report for like citywide, this is as good as any introductory meeting as I've had with any contractor that we've done. So that's really great for you all. One thing I wanted to respond to was the thing about the density of transit stops. I'm not sure if you all included the circulator stops in there.
We found that a lot of the circulator stops were shared with Metro bus stops, and that Open Data DC also has other bus stops as a shapefile, but those were, when we looked at it, it included things like the trolleys from Georgetown, the Kennedy Center lane. So those stops, like we added them there, we counted them, but they were so few that it didn't ultimately change the data that much.
You know, I mean, one thing I just wanted to react to, you said, you know, the density was a bit lower, but then you mentioned that 4 Navy yards can fit in the CBD. Well, if you're looking at a density metric, then it's telling you what the concentration is relative to the land area. So even if you scaled up 4 Navy yards, right, the density would still be the same. But, and I'm not sure, maybe I just missed it. I was so excited and in awe of all the maps and everything. Should I put more accessible parking in Navy Yard based on what you found?
Right, yeah, we basically concluded that to match the like ADA parking in the CBD, there would have to be 83 spaces per square mile. Right.
Yes, yeah, and a lot of our metrics, the data, when we examined all 6 of them, not all of them told us that like the Navy Yard was exactly the same way as the CBD. But then when you actually start looking at the ways in which Navy Yard is different from the CBD, a lot of those data statistics actually make sense. And I think given the success of the stadium parking program that exists partially within Navy Yard, that suggests that there is likely a demand, as well as, you know, the fact that people are going to be using accessible parking within the wider Navy Yard area.
I think it's also kind of important to consider the fact that, like, obviously this fieldwork data is based on what the current condition is, but we all know that Navy Yard is growing really, really rapidly. And so maybe the current data doesn't reflect that necessarily, but I believe that like the projections of what is actually happening and changing, it is really, really important.
And that's why the feature projections was one of our metrics, but we didn't talk more in depth onto that, but it'll be in the
and you know, I think, right, you don't necessarily have to get to exactly where the CBD is, right? There was some time in history when our own CBD wasn't at that density, right? You just, what we're searching for is where you cross that threshold, and it's never going to be a precise number, no matter how many different metrics you have. So I think you all have set up a great methodology for us to just continue to snowball this into something that we can use. I'm a little curious just about, I think I saw this maybe in another presentation, this use of spaces per square mile. I'm just kind of curious why you all sort of chose that to highlight that metric. I have never thought about anything in terms of, you know, density per square mile. That is, I'm not, you know, saying it's necessarily a bad thing. I just think for us, the location of spaces, distribution of spaces is important. But right, I can sort of just draw any arbitrary line and raise or lower that density. So I'm just kind of curious what it meant to you all in the study.
When we were calculating the densities for a lot of these different metrics, we had both the mile, and as well as this conversion to square feet pulled up. And I think just in terms of presenting it, we thought a square mile would be the easiest for the audience to understand instead of presenting it with this giant like 10,000 or 20,000 number, because that would be a little harder to understand. But
yeah, and I think that a map provides a really effective visual to see that density, not a number, but you can see here in the Navy Yard map, all that's concentrated in one corner and not really spread out. Meanwhile, on the CBD, you can see it really spread out. So that density metric kind of pairs with the map, and it's not like a standalone metric. So I think that's why we chose to do both a density per square mile and also a map, so that you can visualize that.
Yeah, last point I'll make, and it's just related to that. I think the reason I asked that question, the reason it's important, what I was just saying about I can shrink or lower that boundary, but also, I mean, just to point out, like this, I don't know precisely where it is, but kind of this whole area here, I can't touch, belongs to the Navy, right? So that's going to greatly distort that metric because, right, I can't touch that land. They do their own stuff there. But, you know, obviously having all of the other maps that you did that show, you know, the use isn't designated there, or maybe it's institutional use or whatever else. But yeah, that's just kind of one of those things to watch out for, because this ends up artificially low because of that.
And I'll also just add that the CBD from a lot of the metrics also suffered from the same problem, given the fact that a lot of the national mall composes the CBD, and when we were trying to calculate the data, selecting, given the way the data was given to us from Open Data DC, we couldn't just cut out the national mall because they included the national mall along with other districts. So we had to sort of pick and choose here in terms of the data.
I think it showed the South Lawn and the ellipse of the White House as vacant, which I don't know is exactly the right designation for that, but we'll take it. But it sounds like you all have to consider that. So yeah, great work.
Great job. What's up here? Reimagining the curve, a rework of NACTO's design.
Hey guys, thank you so much for all of you coming out to watch our presentation and look at the work that we've been doing over the past couple of weeks. We're super excited to share it all with you guys. Our presentation is called Reimagining the Curve, or Rework of NACTO's design. And it's basically just going to be us giving you a bunch of tips on how to assess what your curbside needs, what elements and resources to use to implement those needs into your curbside. And then we're going to give you a little case study of what we think an ideal curb would look like. So my name is Annaca Sutton. I've been working as the project manager for this group, and I've been blessed to be working with a group of really passionate, hardworking individuals, and I will let them introduce themselves to you now. I'm Eva. Hi. I'm Anna. I'm Bridget.
I'm Kai.
And I'm Kenneth.
And we're just going to jump right into it for you guys.
Yeah. So as Annaca said, our presentation today is broken up into two sections. So NACTO stands for the National Association of City and Transportation Officials, and they publish a best practices guide for street design that planners can use all across the country to inform some of their decision making. So first, we're going to go through some of the characteristics of what's in it and some of the areas of opportunity for reworking that we've identified. And then we're going to apply that to our case study of M Street between Wisconsin Avenue and Potomac Street. So we have, for the first part here, we have three characteristic opportunities to address curbside management. These should be efficient, relevant uses of space that are forward-looking and sustainable. And here I've divided up into proactive, agile, and effective. So I'm briefly going to just go through what I mean by that. So adding curbside management into plans proactively integrates this component into land use patterns and with transit and with everything that makes up the urban fabric. It also makes the process democratic because the public has some input on comprehensive plan development. So like how the city is going to develop for the next 5 or 10 years. Curbside management should be agile. It should be able to leverage technology to track changing inventory of parking, bus location, and street flow. Key stakeholders, especially transit users, families, and businesses, should be engaged to inform changes to be made. And decision makers, when it comes to the urban streetscape, should be open to change as street uses and needs evolve. And finally, it needs to be effective. And so we need to determine realistically what our goals are and how we're able to achieve them. And some metrics that we could use include safety, user experience, which I think is often overlooked, like how do people feel using the street, and other economic indicators like retail, foot traffic, and street capacity and flow as well.
Yeah, so my portion is about high-level strategies that can assist in the implementation of a progressive curbside management program. So right now, across the country, curbside management is usually under the umbrella of a city parking program, but as we've indicated, curbside management includes a lot more people than just cars. So in order to transition from a parking program to a curbside management program, we kind of have these following 4 elements that really apply at a high level. So organizational structure and leadership both ask how your organizational chart needs to change when transitioning to a curbside management program. Often that requires looking inward more at organizational values and institutional priorities. Resource support is all about funding, ensures that the governing entity, usually the city, has the resources and is willing to support the parking program or the curbside management program. And then finally, measuring success covers the creation of indicators and performance benchmarks that, as the title suggests, measures the success of the curbside management program. And then measuring success also often requires the implementation of a curbside inventory program. So because in order to create benchmarks, you often have to know what you're dealing with on the curve in the first place to be able to measure success later on.
All right, so the third part of our presentation is the sustainability, equity, and curb use. So I'll start with sustainability. Vehicles obviously emit carbon dioxide. Vehicles with internal combustion engines emit carbon dioxide, which contributes to global warming. And cars emit more while idling. And idling time includes time spent searching for parking. So what we discuss a lot is notifying drivers of where on-street parking is, which we end up limiting in our diagram of an ideal street, and notifying them of where off-street parking is, as guarantee of parking in a lot encourages drivers to stop searching and just go to that lot or wherever the structure, wherever they know that there's going to be parking. And providing this information to drivers in one 2021 study found that carbon dioxide emissions could be reduced by up to 40% in commercial neighborhoods, including the one in Georgetown where we live. We also included designated loading zones, so loading and unloading, which also reduces time spent looking for a place to drop off and pick up. When we went to visit M Street, we saw a lot of Ubers just stopping in the middle of the road to let people in and out. Also on the edge of the extended sidewalk, so giving them a designated space to load and unload increases safety and increases sustainability. Also under sustainability is the issue of electric vehicles, which while they do lessen the emissions of idling, they cause the same issues as other cars in the general curbside space. So on equity, our model is not ADA van accessible, but is ADA car accessible. And notification of where a lot is will also show where guaranteed ADA car and van accessible parking is. And the sidewalk in our model is wide enough for wheelchair users and users of other mobility devices to access it safely.
In the next section, I'm going to be talking about prioritizing valuable curbsides. Curbsides are some of the most valuable portions of a street. And part of that is their proximity to both the sidewalk, which a lot of different variety of users use to get around an area, as well as to the land uses that lay beyond the sidewalk, like stores or open space or parks or offices or residential. And so that portion of the street that lies along the curb has the closest access both to the sidewalk and to what lies beyond the sidewalk. So a progressive municipality should take careful consideration about how they're going to use that super valuable part of the street, because there are a few different options of how you can use that. And it is somewhat revealing of what a city wants to prioritize for a certain area based on what curbside use they might choose. So the first type of use is car uses, which includes parking, in some instances, a direct travel lane right next to the curbside, and other uses like loading and unloading of passengers, commercial loading, and those sorts of things. This has been one of the stronger historical, more frequent uses of the curbside. But as going along with equity and sustainability, it isn't necessarily the most future-facing option to continue prioritizing single user cars in all instances. So we also looked at uses like bus uses. Oftentimes bus stations, bus stops are right next to the sidewalk. And so giving buses shared or dedicated lanes right on the curbside places the buses and all of its many passengers that they can carry the closest access to the bus stops and to the sidewalk, as well as all of those land uses. And then another use that we looked at is bike uses, especially creating dedicated bike lanes right next to the sidewalk that people who want to bike or roll can use. Again, giving that increased access to the sidewalk and to the land uses, as well as creating a separated space for bikes where they're not going to be having conflicts with cars or people, so that the sidewalks are free of bikes and the bikes are not feeling too close to cars. So the biggest thing is, obviously, there are a lot of options for how to use curbsides. There's definitely more beyond these that we looked at. But the most important thing is to take a network approach by looking at your network of streets and considering strategically based on land uses, based on the number of people that are in a given area, and even surveying like we did and seeing which uses are seemingly most wanted by people who are there, what's going to make the most sense for each section of the street. And yeah.
All right, as we all know, technology is becoming an increasingly important part of our everyday lives, and our curbside is absolutely no exception. However, just because technology is becoming more dominant, that doesn't mean that we can't tailor this technology to improve the lives of pedestrians and commuters. Using technologies such as automated enforcement, such as timed parking meters or retractable bollards, as are pictured in these photos in this slide. This helps to enforce curbside rules without the use of physical manpower. As Kenneth just mentioned, the curbside is increasingly becoming one of the most valuable parts of our modern cities. So by using real time zones and modal pricing, it helps both public and private entities kind of accurately estimate what the value of their curbside space is in order to maximize that productivity along the street. And then real-time reservations help people accurately determine what areas of the curb are available to them at a given time, whether that be through parking or through other modes of transportation. Kind of like Eva mentioned, it's super important for sustainability for people to know what's accessible to them and not spend that time idling and looking for parking spaces. And these technologies are not just limited to the space directly next to the curb. They can also be implemented to areas of off-street parking, such as parking garages. And this will further open up the curb to other modes of transportation, which in turn could increase the productivity of your city's curb space, depending on the area that you're in and depending on what you think the needs of that area are.
Yeah, so moving on to how we plan for the future, with the onset of all the new technologies Annaca was discussing, a central operating network that syncs all this curbside use data could aid in efficiency and organization. So take a bus stop. If a bus is only coming once every 10 minutes, for example, if an operating system had that data and made it widely available, that space could be used for other things like rideshare pickups or food delivery services in those other 9 minutes. This would be a more agile use of space. And further, ensuring transit agencies use technology to accurately convey arrival times of buses would allow the space to be more flexible and enable a better seamless user experience while limiting the phenomena of ghost buses, which is currently an initiative being undertaken by Nica. Additionally, it would coordinate with rideshare pickups and autonomous cars to make sure drop-off points are placed in loading zones instead of random locations that any user could select on a map. Or in the case of looking for parking, a citywide operating system could enable users to reserve parking beforehand, reducing idle time, as Eva mentioned, which would help with sustainability, and create an efficient user experience by allowing individuals to pay through an app or online. So as we anticipate the onset of autonomous vehicles, as we have increasing access to modern technology that allows us to track transit systems, and with the implementation of systems like smart parking, it is critical to consider how to best integrate all these technologies while making efficient use of our curb space. And that's really where a central operating system can be helpful.
All right, now that we've kind of discussed some of the key tools that you could use to implement a productive and enjoyable curb space, we're now going to transition into our case study of M Street and give you kind of like a real world example of us using these tools. So currently M Street, as it was designed, is very car dominated. It is 80 feet from building face to building face. 20 of these feet are designated sidewalks, one on each side. And the remaining 60 feet are all car designated space, as you can see in the middle here. During the pandemic, one side of the sidewalk was extended to make room for streeteries for restaurant use. However, we did not portray this in our original model because this is meant to be temporary, and that wasn't how M Street was designed originally. You can see down here in this bottom corner, we used the NACTO analytics to kind of estimate the average amount of traffic per hour that the street gets. And NACTO analytics averages that 20,000 to 24,000 people will be traveling down the street any given hour. The majority of those people will be found on the sidewalks, around 18,000. And then in driving lanes, that would account for between 2,500 and 6,500 people per hour.
So now this is our proposed redesign of M Street. And the main changes we made, we're making this a more multimodal transit center. So as you can see, we've limited the driving lanes. We've cut off one from each side and added in a bike lane that goes 2 directions. One thing that's important to note is that though we have a loading zone next to it, we have a protected bike lane with a line of street trees to help protect those bikers from opening doors from those loading zones. And our other main changes, we're extending the sidewalk permanently to allow for those streeteries. When we talked to the owner of Clyde's, that's the main streetery on this section of M Street, and he thought it was a very productive use of space and helped his company profit. So we thought extending the sidewalk permanently would aid in that. We also added 2 flex zones, which we couldn't really portray in street mix here, but those 2 loading zones on either side, we designated as flex zones, where some areas are for loading, some areas are for metered parking, and where applicable for a bus stop.
So the statistics for this reveal a lot about what a redesign can do. So the estimated average traffic per hour only increased by about 3,000, but the modes in which it changed are important. So the drive lane actually decreased from between 1,200 and 3,200 people being transported via car. However, bike lane increased from 0 to 7,500, and people are already biking on this street. There just are no bike lanes. People are biking in the 1 foot that they have between the edge of the street and the cars that are driving down the road, as we saw when we went and took our observations. We saw many bikers, some of them in their Lycra outfits. But you have to be an experienced biker to be able to use the street as it currently is. So redesigning with a protected bike lane so that everyone can use a bike on this road would be beneficial and increases the potential by a lot. The sidewalk potential remained the same at 18,000 people per hour, but we created a more pleasant pedestrian experience with street trees, permanent streeteries, and hopefully less disruption on the street from bikes and scooters that currently use the sidewalk because they don't have a safe alternative.
Yeah, so this is an aerial view of the same thing that we looked at that Annaca was presenting, the present view of this section of M Street from the top. And we collected this data during our field visit about the specific use of each lane. You can see that in the center section of the street, there are 4 lanes that are just dedicated travel lanes for cars. And then focusing on the differential uses in the outer 2 lanes. On that upper lane, you can see that much of it is in blue as the extended sidewalk. And then there is a section of loading zone in the center, and towards the right, a bus stop in green. And then on the lower section in that 6th lane, we see a section of extended sidewalk in blue, another loading zone in yellow, that purple streetery outside of Clyde's, and then a long section of on-street parking in red.
So then this is going to be what the aerial view would theoretically look like if we implemented that second diagram. So again, in blue, we have the extended sidewalks. The dark purple is the Clyde streetery. Then the light purple represents the bike lanes. The 2 orange lanes in the middle are the 2 traffic lanes, moving traffic lanes. And then the big change here is that we couldn't really depict on the cross-section diagram, is that you can show we have a differential between loading zones, a very, very small amount of on-street parking, because we acknowledge that while no on-street parking would probably be the best situation for M Street, that's really hard to, that can be like politically unfeasible sometimes. So we put most of these in loading zones just to account for the fact that a lot of businesses have drop-offs all the time. There's no alley in the back. We were talking to business owners and they said park like streetery aside, like trucks will physically pull up and just drop off in the middle of the driving lane. That's how they load and unload in Georgetown, which is very suboptimal. So creating these designated loading zones more than exists already now would be very beneficial. Additionally, those loading zones can also be used for Uber drop-offs, which again, we were there. They happen all the time in the most inconvenient spots possible. And then the current bus stop serves lines 38B, and then a circulator line is shared between Wamata and the circulator.
Great. So the point of curbside management is to acknowledge that our cities are changing. As technology, society, and our climate change, we must reconsider how we want to allocate valuable public space like urban curbsides to meet the challenges we collectively face. NACTO best practices are a great place to start. We must ask ourselves who the streets belong to and what kind of cities we want for ourselves and the next generation. Do we want dangerous traffic congested streets? And can we get ahead of autonomous vehicle technology to plan for a harmonious streetscape of the future? Forward-thinking approaches to street design help us move towards pleasant, livable cities for the future. Thank you.
Questions from the audience? Over here.
So I'm curious because I know exactly what you're talking about in N Street with the trucks unloading in the middle of the road. It is extremely annoying, especially when I'm trying to ride at 38 feet to Ballston and get delayed by several minutes. But I was curious, did you have any other corridors, for example, that you could identify where this same practice could be used? Did you try to extend it to any other areas, like specifically in DC?
The idea here is that curbside best manager practices, it really depends physically on whatever block you're on. So when we were talking about like which case study we were going to choose, we were kind of between M Street, K Street, there was Foggy-Bottom, like whichever street we could have picked would have resulted in probably a very drastically different diagram depending on the street. That basically highlights why you have to go to where you're studying, really understand, take curb inventory, figure out what you're dealing with and what the uses of the street are before you can implement the best practices. And the best practices are intended to be a framework that can be applied to like most typical urban streets.
I just wanted to provide a little anecdote. I work retail on Georgetown, not specifically on that street that you discussed, just like right around the corner on Wisconsin Avenue. And I do agree with your proposed plan because I do feel unsafe sometimes with like how many cars are rushing through and just that intersection of M Street and Wisconsin Avenue is incredibly busy. Sometimes on the weekends they have to get DDOT or just like some sort of officers to help move around people driving and everything. So I think like eliminating that parking spaces and like just adding more people to the sidewalks would, I feel like would make things feel more secure.
Yeah, something we felt was even outside the scope of this, but that came up was like corner management. We went to visit on a Sunday and like the corners, like people crowd out and the traffic controllers were like, hey, you can't be in the street because there are cars in the street. And then there are too many people to take up the corner and people flood out. So we didn't get to that niche because we felt it was outside the scope, but that is something to look at further there.
I was just wondering if y'all think that this would have like a significant impact on levels of traffic, like vehicular traffic, in street gets clogged up with the 4 lanes. And while, you know, I think we all support walkable cities and this is ideal, do you think that there would be a lot of pushback from the neighborhood, or would it cause significant issues that couldn't be overcome with the benefits of this curbside management?
I think that would warrant a larger study of like road systems as a whole. But that was something that came up when we talked to people on the street. There was this one person who's lived in the city for 50 years. And I asked him like how he felt about the street and like how it actually makes him feel as a pedestrian and a driver. And he was like, yeah, I definitely could see there being fewer cars, but that would never happen. Like nothing changes. But in my mind, I was thinking, you know, pre-pandemic to post, or like not post, we're still in a pandemic. Pre-pandemic to now, M Street has already changed dramatically. You have like the extended sidewalks, you have streeteries now. Like just in that short amount of time, there's been significant change. And I think if you systematically approach it, everything's a system here. Like if you did actively disincentivize driving and create alternatives like metro, like bus, like actually comfortable and safe to use bike transit lanes, I like, you know, time and time again, cities prove that that's an effective way to approach one of the busiest commercial corridors in the region.
Yeah, I also would like to point out that the street capacity, when we calculated it before and after, it actually went up because of the increase in the bike lanes. That would require people to actually use them, but I think it's been changing, like even a lot since we've been here for the last 4 years. We see so many more pushes for bike lanes. So thinking that becomes a greater part of the culture too, that would help aid in the traffic reduction.
Yeah, I really love the presentation and what you said about idling cars is so valuable. Like snaps, thanks for putting that in there. That was your presentation, right? I feel like I'm mixing it all.
Yeah.
I doubted myself for a second. I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
And just a question that like you might not have an answer to, but just to put out like into the world is like with the cars too, like culturally, cars go so damn fast on that road. Like I cycle and I also work at Blues Alley, 2 jobs full time too. And I bike and like I'm trying to get 15, 20, but I'm just a little girl, I can't really do much. And like buses, like you said, or trucks will just stop. And so many times I'm cycling and I just veer to a sidewalk. And so I wonder just culturally how to get cars to slow the heck down because they're coming from Whitehurst and they're coming from 66.
Yeah, part of the difficulty, I think, do we want to get one back? Like looking at the current design and the number of lanes that are dedicated to cars, is it 75%? 75% is currently given to cars. And all other modes are like allocated to everything else.
Yeah.
And so as part of our design, we would be giving more of the street section back to other modes.
Yeah.
And I think it's a little weird to say, but part of it is making drivers feel a little bit more uncomfortable.
Right.
And so the less room that they have, the more that they have to look. Here we only have one travel lane in each direction, and cars in these lanes would have to be looking at conflicts from the loading zones also. So it'd be a lot harder to just kind of like zoom through.
Yeah.
That would be our goal, I think.
In addition, a growing tree canopy theoretically it should discourage high speeds. We also discussed street signage because like we have other crazy parking signs as well. So like the speed limit signs, I learned for the first time that the like general speed limit in DC is 20 miles an hour unless otherwise posted. I learned that from a sign that was a huge ad on the side of Circulator and not from like anywhere else. Like I don't drive in DC, but I feel like I could have gotten that information earlier than like 3 weeks ago. I grew up here and I never knew that. Yeah, it's like thank you, Circulator. But
Also, there's a saying, like I think the Dutch have the saying, but it's like if you have to put signs up to regulate behavior on how people use the street, then maybe you need to reconsider the design because the design should make it inherent to the user. And the fact that M Street is so wide, like Kenneth said, that's part of the issue.
it feels like
a thoroughfare. Yeah, it is. It literally is. And you can't have both.
Yeah.
I love your presentation. I love the use the street mix here because I think that's a really great way for folks to visualize. DDOT uses that in our community engagement. Just a couple of notes I want to make. So love the plan. You all don't have the benefit of history that I have. If I take your plan to the ANC and the bid, forget Russia and Ukraine, World War III is starting right there. But that's not your fault. It's still a great plan. I love the idea. There's 2 things I wanted to talk about. Accessibility. I think you all talked about some loading zones that are protected with tree boxes and other things like that. Just remember, if you put a tree box next to my loading zone, it's not ADA compliant. So it's going to get you in a little bit of trouble. There are literally tens of thousands of incidences in the district, and it's one of those weird things. It's neither here nor there. We'll never get sued, but if we sort of call attention to it, we might. And then also related to accessibility, and I meant to highlight this for the other group, be very careful about the language. DDOT has people first language, so we don't say disabled people, we say people with disabilities. We do not say handicap in our official public communications, although, sometimes there's ancient language and other things that we're reading. But if I take you to the US Access Board, or I take you to the Office of Disability Rights in the district, you say handicap a couple of times, somebody's going to stop you in the meeting and say, please don't use that word. So if you want to sound very sophisticated, progressive, and well-educated and impress me in the job interview that I'm sure everybody's going to have when they apply to work at DDOT, that's a great way to make yourself stand out amongst other candidates. So just wanted to drop that line for y'all.
What was the first thing we did?
People first. So we use people first language. So we typically, say somebody has mobility challenges, or there's a person with a disability. We don't say handicap. You can just say accessible, or you can say ADA accessible. But the H word is, offensive to many folks in that community. And again, on a lot of instances, they'll point it out to you. People are generally not rude, and they know we're kind of in a transitional time in our lives. But that's a great way to make yourself stand out when you're looking for employment.
Also notice there's a question in the chat.
That's what we want.
Yeah, that was definitely something that we were thinking about a lot, like especially given the pedestrian volume. One issue, like geographically and logistically, is that this is the major corridor that goes from the areas kind of west of Rock Creek Park to the central area of DC. And so obviously, given the amount of commercial and the amount of foot traffic, it would be amazing if M Street could be pedestrian only. But I think that would have to involve some sort of alternative corridor, which I don't know if that would even be possible, of car traffic from areas west of Rock Creek into the center city.
I mean, Whitehurst Freeway's already there. I mean, it's just so strange to me, like thinking about the concentration and like the frequency of traffic flow on M Street, especially considering Whitehurst Freeway was like literally a blight, like built there to like kind of prevent this, but it's still like, sorry, anyways.
Well, it's interesting because when we were talking to people, so we just were straight up like stopping people off the street, being like, "What's your experience on this road?" And they were like, "What kind of questions on?" But a couple people, once we flagged down more people our age, then we were like, "We're doing a capstone project where like, oh, we're Georgetown students." Like we got a conversation going, but a lot of them were just kind of talking about how they wish, it was kind of like pedestrian centered traffic and like pro-transit traffic or pro-transit streets were just like a pipe dream. They're kind of like, oh, like that would be great, but yeah, they're like businesses too. Everyone's just kind of like, oh, that would be awesome. Can't happen. But I was like, why can't it happen?
It's also really interesting considering since Georgetown is like so ideologically against like transit, or like we don't want a metro stop here. Like there shouldn't be inclusive, transit here as well. I think I really liked your presentation, you guys. I thought it was super interesting, especially since like I think M Street in Georgetown specifically is such like a desirable neighborhood, theoretically. And is considered like super walkable, relatively speaking. And so like I like the general like movement as like young geographers that we have of critiquing spaces that are already meant to be like the standard. That's something I really appreciated in your presentation as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Question, not a question, I'm gonna give you a comment. You have to think it's possible. You're the generation that has to make that happen, right? So take whatever advice, we all work at Metro. So my number one advice for this whole group is to don't constrain yourself. Because if you start constraining yourself at your age, you have no chance. When you end up like us after like years of those battles. So like a good example is if you all think that M Street from, that's Potomac to Wisconsin, right? Yeah. I mean, first of all, if you said that was pedestrian only, I would be against you. Because where the buses go, right? You gotta have some, what we're trying to actually accomplish is to move human beings at the same time. So we're trying to make it more equitable, more sustainable. The number one thing we got to do is get people out of cars. Period. Yeah. So that should be the first number one goal we always have. But that stretch could easily be a dream of doing a transit mall.
We were talking about that.
Like, right? And that's what K Street, hopefully we can get K Street to a level that is there. It's going to be a little challenge, but working on it. 8th Street has a chance to move significant. So, take it from what it is for someone that's been through a lot of battles. You got don't constrain yourself. Dream and then push the dreams. So Kimmy's with me. We left Austin. We pulled off a massive transit referendum and changed a city forever, and included talking about transit malls and where UT is and a bunch of other things. If you're not willing to put some difficult things down, you're never going to change minds, right? So congratulations on all your presentations. I thought, sitting here watching them, it's like inspiring, to see young people thinking of all this stuff. And DDOT might be looking for people, but Metro, we're always hiring as well. And we got planning departments and a lot of performance and analytics. But the thing I love the best is you're using data to come together with ideas. And I think the number thing I encourage you on that, not just don't be constrained, is get involved. Right? Like civic engagement in America is dominated by people 65 or older that don't want to change. Period. In every city. Every city's the same way.
in lots of places at public meetings designed, so they actually have input and others don't, purposely. Right? And they have tons of political capital because they own property. So young people are the chance to move things forward. And again, don't be naive. You have a lot more power. Last Tuesday showed how much young people have power. If you want to move the needle, you're the biggest group there is in the country. And the only chance we got, listen, I'm going to be dead, right? You're going to be living. Climate change is the existential threat to this planet. And so every human being you can get on a bus versus a car is a game changer. Every person that rides a bike or walks is a game changer. So anyway, thanks for Anna invited us to come here. So thank you, Anna. And like that's like look at that leadership professor out of nowhere. You know, you got one of your students reach out to the Metro general manager and says, "Would you come to a thing?" And that's the kind of like. Just go do it and dare someone to prove you all wrong. So anyway, I just wanted to give you some kudos. I was really impressed with everything you did. So thanks for having us here today. Sorry.
Last but not least, ED, charging future.
Like somewhere.
Really, yeah, keep up the good work. And thanks for like the good leadership. So keep up that good work. Vermont website. We'll be hiring. Is this a graduating one?
Yeah.
Right. Yes. When you all graduate.
Right.
We'll see. Okay. Excellent. Well, third, you're always looking for great people. Okay. Excellent. So thank you. Keep up the good work. She's the head of planning.
Fires though.
So Allison said, and
Guarantee and contact with the people that are responsible.
Because one of the key things about frequency.
They don't make.
Getting out of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Our presentation. Wow, that's good. Save it for the end. Our presentation is going to be about the future of electric vehicle charging in the District of Columbia. My name is Jack. I'm the project manager.
I'm Kate. Outreach mostly.
I'm Anna. I work on GIS. I'm Celeste. I did urban planning research. I'm Stina. I also did research. I'm Danielle.
So here's what we're going to do in this presentation. First, we're going to review the current state of EV charging infrastructure in DC. Then we're going to take a look at the decision-making process for individual purchasing an EV. Then we're going to talk a bit about DC's transportation electrification roadmap, which is a new report, brand spanking new, came out in September of this year. That took a really in-depth look at electric vehicle charging. And then we're going to discuss the GIS analysis we did, also discuss the ANC survey we did, and then make some recommendations about how we think EV charging can be improved in the future.
Okay, so first, I'm gonna give y'all an overview of EV charging, just because I feel like it needs to be demystified for a lot of people. Did me, I don't drive a regular car even. So I had no idea how to go about this. So first off, there are 3 different chargers that you can use. They're levels 1, 2, and 3. And as you increase in level, you increase in efficiency. Also, it can increase in price. Then there are 3 ways that you can charge your cars. One is at home, and those use level 1 chargers that usually come with a purchase of an electric vehicle, and they can just kind of plug into the outlets in your house. Those are going to take a while to charge your car. So those are usually for like overnight, very slow pace, not like a gas station. Level 2 charging stations are a lot of the public ones. As you can see, there are 237 public level 2 EV charging stations. And then there are private charging stations. Private charging stations are going to be in workplace garages and residential garages that are limited by like a tap-in access. And public chargers are in a lot of grocery store parking lots or in some community centers. Although a specific note on the grocery store one is that some grocery stores actually do require you proof of purchase for you to be able to charge your car there. So with that, all of those charging stations, all the different types that you could choose from, every individual one is also different depending on who owns it and who is supplying the energy. Price is set by the owner of the station. It can differ from station to station across the street. For your home charging, it depends on your local energy prices. So it's going to be really different here than it is going to be in Ohio. But 54% of the chargers in DC are free to use. Some use subscription-based, some are paid for use, but there's a significant amount that are free to use. With the layout that you'll eventually see of the charging stations, plus all the different types, plus the cost, plus the time that it takes to charge, because it takes anywhere from like hours to half an hour for one of the faster ones. It's not a come and go gas station, you're in and out in 5 minutes. It's very difficult to plan your day if you're inexperienced with electric vehicle charging, especially for long road trips. It's extremely hard trying to find that. And if you find yourself running out of charge, it's probably going to be more of a scramble than just, oh, here's the Exxon. Luckily, there are a lot of apps that have interactive maps where you can find that stuff, but it does require a bit of learning, and it's a bit of a consumer obstacle for anyone trying to make this change. With that, there are also some issues of curbside management with electric vehicles, and that's usually due to a big lack of a comprehensive policy on that throughout the entire district. A lot of the burden of understanding and following policies is put on the owner, which can be a bit difficult once you're already trying to, have this new car, help the environment, and then you're trying to charge it somewhere. But then also there are a lot of policies that you might not know about, which one of the biggest ones is the Cortney street policy. So DDOT really doesn't like having the charging cords anywhere in the sidewalk or the street. That makes sense. But it's difficult for homeowners because in DC there aren't gap parking garages or driveways like you have in a lot of residential neighborhoods in suburban areas. So if you can't park in your garage, or if you can't park in your driveway, having to charge your car at home. So this man creatively has his charging cord through his window into a tree that you can see on the right side, because it is technically DDOT compliant, because it's not in public right away. On the left, you can see this is also technically compliant because it has a barrier over it, but it's really not like recommended because it is inaccessible in a lot of ways and still a barrier. Although a lot of homeowners like that one don't have any other way to charge their car. So there's a major misunderstanding of where to go with this problem.
Right. And so there's like some kind of surrounding policy incentives as we await the installment of a bunch more EV chargers across the district. So first in DC, there's some district specific policies. There's the alternative fuel vehicle infrastructure and conversion tax credit. And that applies to individuals and businesses. Basically 50% of the costs get reimbursed to you for purchasing and installing a private charging station. You can also get a lot of money back for converting your vehicle to electric, or to other things. I think a bunch of other alternative fuels too. DC would like for you to convert your vehicles. And then you also can get money back for like you don't have to pay the excise tax that you would normally have to on like a new car that's gas powered. And then federally, it was a big deal earlier this semester when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. $1.7 billion was set aside in tax credits for EV charging related equipment over the next decade. And specifically what that looks like on the individual level is you can get $1,000 or 30% of installation costs, like reimbursed to whichever is lower. And then there's also a federal tax credit of $7,500 toward the purchase of a vehicle, an electric vehicle. And then there's also this $4,000 or 30% back for previously owned vehicles. And then finally, for businesses, they can get 30% back or $100,000 per charger. But importantly, for this business incentive, it only applies to lower income areas, which is specifically where the median family income does not exceed 80% of the metropolitan area's median income. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at if you're an individual and you want to get an EV and you want to charge it, what do you do? How do you go about that? So the first basic choice you have to make is to get a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, a PHEV, or a battery electric vehicle, a BEV. So PHEVs have both electric and internal combustion engine capabilities. So they'll have typically a smaller range. The range is how far the car can drive on its electric charge. So they'll have a smaller range, and then they'll have like gas and standard internal combustion engine as well that the car can switch to when it runs out of electric charge. So that will together bring it up to the range of a normal vehicle. However, it will have a lower distance it can drive on just the electric charge. Whereas a battery electric vehicle only has the electric charge. The range on new BEVs gets up close to what typical internal combustion engine vehicles have as well. But it only runs on the electric. So if you do run out of charge, you don't have that option to switch. So level 1 chargers can be used with either. However, they are mostly useful for PHEVs just because they are so slow, because they have a smaller range. Like if you plug in a PHEV overnight with a level 1 charger, it can be fully charged in the morning, whereas the BEV, it will probably still not be fully charged, which is why level 2 chargers there are ideal for both. They work for PHEVs and they can fully charge most BEVs overnight. And then you also have DC fast charging, which can fully charge BEVs or charge them up to 80% in 30 to 40 minutes. The 80% is because it slows down towards the end. Don't need to get into that right now. So basically, if you have a PHEV, you're going to use a level 1 or a level 2 charger. And if you have a BEV, you're going to want to use a level 2 or 3, although you can still use a level 1 if that's all you have access to. Okay, so then where are you going to charge this EV? So you can charge it at home. The level 1 cords come with all electric vehicles. So you always have that option. Those just plug into your standard wall outlet. Or you can install a level 2 charger in your home. This costs between $1,500 and $3,000 on average. However, that varies depending on like how old your home is. Sometimes you do upgrades, et cetera, et cetera. And you can also get some money back in that in the incentive Jake was talking about earlier. Level 3 chargers are typically too expensive to install in a home unless you're like crazy rich. Option 2 is at work. So some workplaces have like a private parking garage or other private employee parking where they have electric vehicle chargers, but this is only an option if that's already the case. There's not much you as an individual can do about that other than maybe talking to your employer. But and then for the final option is public chargers. So these are found at businesses, at restaurants, in various other like places where you might go and park your car and leave it for a little while you go do some other thing. And then you pay for this. Typically, well, 54% are free to use in the district, but otherwise you pay through like apps that are subscription services. Some have fees, some don't. And in the case that they don't, you pay by the time you charge it, and even when they do, you still pay by the time usually, but it's just lower rate. And then, okay, so this is going off of the home tab in this one. If you need to install a charger in your home, how are you going to go about that? So, or just to charge your car at home in general. So you can put the cord across the sidewalk, as we discussed, using the level 1 charger. If you do not have access to off-street parking. And then in that case, you also have to follow the DDAC guidelines, like the cord speed parallel across the street, covered, et cetera, et cetera. If you do have access to off-street parking, like in a garage or a private space, you can install a level 2 charger. And I talked about that in the last slide, $1,500 to $3,000.
Yeah, so next we're going to talk about this new report that came out, DC's Transportation Electrification Roadmap. It was created by the Department of Energy and Environment in 2019, and it came out in September of this year, which was poor timing on our part because most of the work is already done. It was developed working with district agency stakeholders and industry stakeholders, as well as the public. And the goal of this roadmap was to reach the goal of DC becoming a carbon neutral city by 2050. And they want to do this by achieving having 25% zero emission vehicle registered by 2030, which can only be done by increasing the number of residential, public, and workspace level 2 and DCFC fast chargers. And they also want to increase public buses, light duty vehicles, and commercial fleets to electric by 2045. So to increase the number of electric vehicles, they want to increase the number of chargers, and they recommend prioritizing locations with high traffic and commuting, environmental justice and opportunity areas, as well as gap fill areas, which are areas that are lacking chargers, to fill in the gaps and narrow down the proximity of chargers in the city. There are 11 sections to this roadmap, which are listed on slides, and they mainly focus on equity and community engagement, as well as how to increase the number of EVs and then also chargers in the city. And it's focused on being dynamic, and it's going to be reviewed every 2 years to make sure that it's on the right track and up to date.
Yeah, so with our GIS analysis, we focused heavily on those electrification roadmap priorities when trying to make our final map outputs. So those are things like being district-owned property, also being income eligible for the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as focusing on traffic volumes and gap filling. So these were the data layers that we used. Most of it came from Open Data DC. And we also were able to obtain air pollution data from Dr. Annenberg, who's the head of the Daily Climate and Health Institute. So we were able to make 2 final cartographic outputs, highlighting a few different things. So on the left, you have the air pollution concentrations by ward, as well as existing public charging locations, and then also your annual average daily traffic count. And then on the right, you have existing public charging locations, but you also have those Inflation Reduction Act eligible and district-owned land, which is in the darker blue, and then in the teal is just district-owned land to highlight the difference and show that we really want to focus in the darkest blue areas. So from these outputs, we are planning to highlight Ward 7 and 8 in our final report as recommendations for gap fill, as well as opportunities for lots of district-owned land and income eligible land. And also they have a lot of the darker red roads, which have high vehicle traffic roads. So that's where we're planning to focus our recommendations for putting in more public charging, as there's also very few orange dots in those words.
Yeah, so at the base of our project, and when we were all sitting down and kind of figuring out what we wanted to do with EVs, we really wanted to involve the actual community because nobody knows the needs of the community better than the residents of DC. But we can't contact every single resident. So Jake contacted every single ANC, which was awesome. And we had 44 responses to the survey, which prefaced it by being like, it would be great if you could tell us on publicly owned land, 1 to 3 locations you believe are best suited for the installment of EV charging, just gave a little blurb. And we sorted through all of their responses. One of those is there, so that's the kind of responses they were giving. They definitely seemed like they needed a place to, talk about their grievances. So I went through and I turned their grievances into coordinates. And then, yeah, so I got about 60 locations out of what they were saying. And it was interesting because the popular locations are places where you would really stay a while. So like community centers, parks, schools, private properties, metered parking. And that was across the board in a lot of places that they wanted. So just like Anna was saying, anything brown or hatched kind of signifies like which they would be eligible for, like what money would help fund it. And then just this quote over here, I can read, it's from an ANC. And it says, there's very little district-owned land in our ANC. Suggest providing charging at curbside power infrastructure such as streetlight poles. Schools won't work since parking around the schools is often reserved for teachers. No one drives to the library in our ANC, so no point putting chargers there. Can't really think of any other DC-owned land. We'll likely need to provide on private land, such as an apartment building, parking lot, garages, and Union Station. So I thought that was really interesting because the most popular places are the one that this ANC asserts would absolutely never work. And I think it just really goes to show with all three of these maps that there is just very, very little district-owned, managed, or operated land, which is the shapefile that we used. So it makes it really difficult to find good locations that will, you know, like work for the needs of the residents and represented by the agencies.
So just some recommendations. I think it's like, so clearly there's like a ton of money to like that incentivizes building EV charging on this like district-owned land designated for public use. But we kind of realize there's maybe a mismatch between where those areas are and like where the community actually wants charging. So like obviously we should take advantage of those tax incentives like where it makes sense, but we shouldn't like let that be the end all be all. And it likely just means that like kind of public charging stations in the way that we like imagine gas stations probably aren't like the best fit for DC. Probably a lot more of these kind of like smaller solutions like the curbside charging, like the parking garages, like having charging in your own home. All the things like that are really important. And we really wanted to especially emphasize the curbside charging here in the like DC electrification roadmap that we were talking about earlier. One of the like laundry list of policies that they say they could maybe do, it's unclear like which ones they're actually going to do in DC, is just like, I think the language was like, work on a curbside policy. They didn't actually say like what that curbside policy is going to be. So we think like, given the fact that they have this long list of policies they're maybe going to pursue, the curbside one should be a priority, and like actually ironing out what that policy is going to look like should also be a priority. There's some case studies that we can like look to at like Sacramento, LA, Hoboken, Staten Island have all kind of been messing with this. But ultimately, like what it's going to boil down to is maybe some like charging that's on the curbside that you pay for that's like connected to the street posts. There's one ANC in DC, I forget which one, who's advocating for allowing residents to like dig under the sidewalk and have their cord come like pop back out the other side. A lot of things like that. But basically we just think that should be like one of the big focuses moving forward, because the tax incentives won't necessarily just like make that magically happen.
So
Do you think it's possible with the improvement of technology, because obviously you said how even with level 3 it takes up to 40 minutes for a car to be like almost fully charged. Do you think that with the improvement of technology and maybe even making a level 4 battery charging where it can take up to 10-15 minutes to charge a car, do you think we can incorporate that to existing gas stations?
I mean, if you were like, so fast chargers are very expensive to install, so there aren't very many at the moment. But they could function like a gas station in the sense that like, if you only wanted to charge your car enough for your commute, that could take like 10 minutes with a fast charger. 30, or when I say 80% charge, that's like out of a range of like over 200 miles. Right, so it can work in like a gas station format with fast chargers, except like economically, that's not very viable at the moment. Like fast chargers are exponentially more expensive than level 2 chargers to install. But it is the case, like, so if you had a gas station that's like in a low income area, you could get these tax benefits and like change one of your pumps to like being an EV zone, like where people also go to fill up their tank or something like that.
I think also one thing, like with your comment about technology, we can also consider like battery capacity, and that's constantly improving. And there's new EVs coming out that have farther and farther range. So with that like longer range, you don't have to charge as often. So that's something else to consider when you're thinking about improved technology. Like if you have to only charge your car, like if you don't drive that much, which most people don't, like I think it's like, I don't remember the number, but like the average person drives like 5 miles a day or something like that, like very little, like no one's actually taking that many long road trips. Like that is just something to consider with the battery, like.
Great presentation. I was curious to what level of, like, especially based off of the ANC comment, like to what level of public-private partnership could there be in the installation of potential EV spaces for public use? Like, you know, if there isn't public grounds for it, could there be something along the lines of the ANC or DC government cooperating with private enterprises, private parking spaces to allow such installation?
Yeah. Yeah, I think they could, and basically like what we were trying to get at with like the tax incentives and then like the conclusion that DC reached in that report is like the most cost-effective way to install new charging would be in the places that are like income eligible, district-owned land, and then like a private company coming in and like kind of ponying up to like install it, and then like DC making it as amenable as possible for that to happen. And then like as you start stripping away like those different factors, like that'll all make it more expensive to do.
I think it was well, first of all, again, like great presentation, love the maps and all of these. But in it's either Arlington or Alexandria, I think, maybe it could be DC, but you mentioned like running the cord under the sidewalk and popping out on the other end. I've heard that there's like permitting processes available in a nearby county that does that, but the entire expense is on the owner of the house. So I read somewhere it's like $3,000 to $5,000 for that installation, which I think makes it really inaccessible. So can you see that being like a feasible option for DC? Because that's a pretty significant cost on top of buying your car.
I mean, I think it has to be an option to have that cord. Like so many people live here, don't have private parking spaces, don't have garages, live in a townhouse, and have to run the cord from their house if they want to have one. So in like facing that problem, most people would choose not to have one. But we want to try and implement this change. So I think like part of like what needs to change is the cost of that. Should not be that much money, or like some of the financial incentives could go towards that cost. But I don't know necessarily in DC if that is the cost. I do believe you have to get a permit to run the cord across the sidewalk, and then you're supposed to cover it with that ADA accessible cover. So that's when a wheelchair could roll over the cord. So I think you do have to apply for a permit, but I don't know what the cost is here.
I think it's really interesting, just this project overall, like can highlight a lot of the like raging inequalities in the district, just one economically, the differences in neighborhoods, and also just kind of like a knowledge barrier, or even like access to internet to find out these permit policies, and how to apply for them and wait for them and pay for them. And it's a very important thing to think about on top of how do you charge your car once you get one, if you can get one.
Sorry, I guess a follow-up question then is, and I don't know if y'all have an answer for this, but like, do you all have any concern, like equity concerns with the government incentivizing through taxes, electric vehicle usage? Like that's tax money that everyone, I'm assuming everyone is paying into, when perhaps like other modes of transit could be encouraged instead of EVs, like public transit or biking or walking.
Yeah, I mean, that was like one of the first things we talked about. We're like, okay, well, we're in the EV group, and we're like, is this the answer? And then like, yeah, so just like, no, I mean, that was definitely a concern of ours, is like, I mean, we also talked about how like cars will not go away. It would be better if they were electric. I mean, there's a variety of reasons that like, maybe until public transport is like more accessible, or like, we were talking about like if you have a wheelchair, like getting that into the bus and alerting the bus driver that you needed to come down, and then all that. It's like, some people really do need cars. And yeah, so I don't know. I think our take on it from the very beginning was like cars will need to be in DC. Like we should find a sustainable and equitable way to do it. But definitely there were like equity challenges and like who already has the EVs, who has access to getting the EVs, and then how is there going to be a delay kind of between getting EVs and getting a way to equitably charge your EV. But yeah, it's definitely a concern.
And like, I guess DC's credit in that report, we keep talking about the way they preface that whole thing. It's like they put EVs at like the bottom of like the electrification totem pole. They're like, first, we want to make sure like we're electrifying other forms of transportation. We're like incentivizing using public transit. Like the whole framing of this report was like, the goal should be to have less cars, but like those cars that we still do have should be EVs. So yeah, totally important to realize that like this should not all be to incentivize like more cars existing.
Great question.
Really, they were all great, so you should give yourselves.
If any institution or agency uses our materials, can we make sure that we're all like credited properly and you know, yeah.
Great.
Hey, thanks everybody. This is fantastic. This was the second time we've done this together, and I think this class, last class was great. This class raised the bar, particularly on what we talked about on independence, on taking the topics and running with them. I'll ask David to comment on that in a second, but last year we really worked closely, almost weekly, right, with groups. Whereas this, it was more, here's your assignment, we're here to help. The product's fantastic. So the group that was doing the research / NACTO, so much great discussion on the case study. I didn't get a chance to ask any questions about the research. So why don't I just do that offline? Maybe we could just do a virtual call. So
I was just going to say that all the chapters that we've been typing up so far are in a folder in the shared drive. So you should have access to those in case you'd like to like work through and kind of read what we've been typing up so far.
yeah, because like your comments on prioritization, for example, and being sure that that conveys to measures of success on the way you described it. And then you're also talking about the value of curb space now, the demand for the curb space. How does that get to equity? Right, in equitable access and sustainability. There have been some recent case studies that have come out of LA that are really good. So just things that I could just, as you're crossing the finish line, happy to help with. And I think we mentioned across the board that we want to take the appropriate, screening through your professor to highlight them on our website, on board progress's websites, and give you credit. And then in the research side of it, really even integrate that further into where it has the 21 elements and description, and complement that, but with credit to what you guys are doing and have done right up. And so want to make sure that that stuff happens, and why we wanted to have these presentations now and not get past the end of the class. But those follow-up items, certainly Fairfax County was called. Fairfax County and to have that follow-up meeting with Henry. She would really appreciate what she's done and get the meeting. So, and then there's the DC projects. And David, do you want to comment on those?
Y'all heard me talking. I'm sorry, bald head. That's fine. It's cold. I agree. Great work to everybody. And like I said, the quality of work that we've seen is great. I'm only 4 years removed from my grad degree in transportation planning, and it's like the level of sophistication just ramps up like every year. So it's like, what's going to happen in 10 years, 20 years? Just to kind of sew up a few different things. You get the general manager of Metro coming, so that's a big deal. And to what he was saying, I work in government, so high five to whoever made that. Credit or blame, right?
I tweet you guys. That's
When we do these big public projects, right? It's not because all 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia weighed in or voted or made some comment or whatever else we got, or 2/3 majority or whatever it is. I say 12 people. If I trace back all of the email trails for everything that we've actually completed and really put in the ground, I guarantee you the contact list of people that really made that happen in the communities, probably a dozen or less. I mean, really. So you can have sort of disproportionate impact if you just show up and keep showing up and keep showing up and keep showing up. Whether that keep this group together is well, yeah, whatever, you know, you've got enough folks in this room actually to kind of talk to anybody else. I mean, it's a give and take, whether it's in your capacity as a, you know, resident or citizen, or it's your professional capacity, or it's a mix of both, right? Because you know, a lot of folks think it's the government, and yes, the government becomes this big nebulous cloud thing, but I'm a person. I'm a native Washingtonian. I live at 13th and S. I have seen my neighborhood transform. I have thoughts and feelings about it. In the professional space, my professional judgment has to trump my personal preference. And, you know, this is, you know, going through school and getting this education, having this experience, and these experiences help you do that. So really, you know, great work. I am hiring actively on my team. I think which is a higher party than the others that have spoken. Well, yeah, I think I think the job is getting posted this week, but as a transportation planner, it's a grade 11, it's a CF 11, so it's actually a pretty good salary. It's great for undergrad or graduate degree person who's looking, if you're looking to do curbside management. If you want to present a TRP, I can get you there. If you want to present an IPMI or NACTO or APA, anywhere you want to get your face out there and stand up and show people what you've done on behalf of district government, I could do it. Like, I can make that happen. It happened for me. And so now I'm trying to step out of the way to get my staffers there. So if you're interested in working for the department, please reach out to me. I think you already have my contact information. I will tell you the good, bad, and ugly, because I don't believe in just glossing it over and making it sound all wonderful. I can tell you everything you'll hate about the job. Or probably will. So that's what they have to first. Well, hey, happy I'm glad to talk, and as you can tell, I'm really great job. No, I'm good. Awesome. Thank you.